What is going on, you guys? It's your boy, Mr. Always Right here, and we are back with episode 153 of the video game therapy series. My intro is getting to be a mouthful, but I guess I kind of signed myself up for it at this point. Can't really turn back. But yeah, I got a few thoughts to share with the void today. My first is about a very popular topic: autistic people. I'm kidding. I had this idea about I guess how to remove a lot of the corruption in politics. Now, it's no secret. I mean, unless you're a complete moron, that that the kind of the whole field of politics, you don't really. I don't know that many like true do-gooders that go into politics, and the ones that do are easily I don't know, easily bought out, or at some point they, kind of compromise morals and things. I'm not very confident in people that have ever chosen politics as a career, just only because it doesn't really lend itself to, it's a thankless job even when done correctly. And again, now it's almost just implied, I think, especially with younger generations' viewpoints of politics, that you're kind of some degree of a scam artist or a con artist if you are a politician. Not saying that that's right or that is always the case. I'm sure that your local congressman is great. I'm sure everyone whatever. But by and large, I think a younger generation is not very doesn't see very fondly upon politicians. But one way I think we could reverse that is with the use of high functioning, of course, but high functioning autistic people. Because if there is something I do know about that group, I'm not going to tell you why, but they are extremely principled and also don't pick up on these social cues that are probably necessary for a lot of the under the table corruption, right? I was telling my friend, a friend of mine, about this idea, and he kind of had like this mock interaction where, the autistic politician is there, and you're talking about, I'm sorry, we can't do this deal. It just doesn't make sense, financially, or whatnot, or the logistics don't work, or whatever. He obviously wouldn't be that articulate because he's autistic. He would just say the numbers, computer says no or something. But the person would try to bribe them and be like, would this change your mind? He goes, oh, thank you for the money. That's very nice of you. But no, we still can't do that. Like he wouldn't, he would fail to understand that he's being bribed to, change his opinion, but he won't. And that is one of the better things about, again, I'm speaking of a very small subset of highly autistic, yet high functioning autists that are extremely and deeply principled about things, and not only in ways that are in line with the law, but some of them, again, I suppose if you're thinking in this way, you could program them correctly to kind of have those guardrails of the law, and they'd be a lot more trustworthy. Only because even if suppose they were to be to lie, it'd be pretty easy to tell, I think. Again, if they were the right kind of autistic, in my opinion, because you can kind of tell when they're telling a lie. Not to say it's similar to the way people with Down syndrome tell lies, but they tell lies in like almost cute ways. It's like, all right, they're obviously lying. It'd just be like whereas a smooth talker would have a much more difficult time, or a much easier time, kind of convincing people that they aren't lying. I think an autistic person would have a lot of trouble with that, just because that's not their, it's not their forte. They'd also, I would think, would approach a lot of these sociological problems with a lot less, with a lot less emotion, which again might sound like a bad thing, but I think in a lot of cases, if you're dealing with numbers that are this, like if you're like essentially playing like Civilization 5, except with the real economy, like if you're playing a, essentially a game where you have to assume people aren't people and instead are, units of labor in the economy. Because that's kind of the way that government is set up now, because it's so enormous. You can't really view individuals as like people in some ways. Or at the very least, if you can, you end up coming to these really strange, like, trolley problems where you're not really able to optimize anything and you end up killing everybody, because you're trying to protect, some group. But if you view it, strictly as, again, as an autist would, where it's all just numbers, and these are all numbers that, and again, they're very complicated, but, they have a lot easier time making decisions that would be difficult for people that, not to say are more in touch with their morality per se, but just have, a lot more visible empathy on things. That being said, I am also kind of being I'm being facetious and with the understanding that there are many high functioning autists that are probably great liars, and also terrible with numbers. I'm not saying that they are, but it would just be funny to promote that idea into government instead of the usual smooth talking douchebags that we have, in modern day. Uh, Here's another thing I guess that has I don't know it just seems to bother me often is this distinction between intelligence and wisdom. And not only that, like the I'll say the intelligence by via proxy, through credentials and through like years of experience or something. Because the amount of time people like have used like this, well, I've been doing this for 20 years. It's like that doesn't say anything. You could still be doing it wrong for 20 years, right? Like you could go up to an alchemist and be like, what you're doing is stupid or something, and or whatever. It doesn't matter. Like someone that is doing something that's not a real science, at least by modern standards, and say, well, what you're doing is stupid. They go, what are you talking about? I have a degree in this, and I've been doing this for 20 years. I guess, yeah, okay, fine, but that doesn't mean anything. That doesn't prove anything. You could still be doing it wrong for 20 years. It wouldn't really matter. Um, but more importantly, this distinction between intelligence and wisdom, because there are people that are by no doubt they are intelligent. I'm not doubting them at all, and I'm mostly pointing the finger at these tech clowns that are kind of for lack of a better word, just raping the planet and kind of savaging everything into some stupid libertarian free market thing. I don't even know what really the underlying philosophy is, but there's no doubt that these people are intelligent. By whatever way you want to measure that, just by processing speed or decision making, prowess. But the issue is they, in my view, lack the sufficient wisdom to make the proper decisions. And intelligence without wisdom is, just kind of like more gunpowder in the gun. But wisdom might be a gun is probably a terrible analogy. But if we're thinking about murdering problems with the gun, wisdom might be a longer barrel or kind of the spiral indents on the bullet that aim the bullet, right? So intelligence might give you a very powerful blast, but you have no fucking clue where it's going because you lack the wisdom to make decisions. That being said, I think it does require a certain amount of intelligence to be wise. Meaning that you have to have a certain amount of gunpowder in the gun for it to be an effective gun. Otherwise, you're just kind of, it's a water gun. It's a squeak toy. Whereas I think now people are so, they're so interested in being this intelligent or being smart, they kind of forget that intelligence is useless without the wisdom to guide it. And the other issue with even bringing up this idea of wisdom is that it isn't, for these autistic tech people, it's not really a measurable characteristic. There is no WQ test where, a wisdom quotient test where we can say, who is wise. It truly is, again, to try not to be philosophical, it is really just how you live your life, and the philosophies that guide your decision making point to how wise or your level of wisdom. And that also isn't something that can be objectively measured, even by any standard really. I'm not saying, I'm not even advocating for the creation of some standard, because that would again be gamed in the same way that a lot of intelligence standards are gamed, and people can get really good at these intelligence tests but still really lack any discernible use for this intelligence. Even like being good at a trivia game or something is some form of intelligence. Having a powerful rote memory and an ability to recall things quickly. But beyond that, there is kind of a limit to that amount of practical intelligence. Something I encountered in this book that I'm reading, which I mentioned last episode. But the book is called Flow. It's by this Czech guy, and it essentially equates the amount of human happiness to the proportionally to the amount of time spent in these flow activities, which are activities that you kind of lose sense of yourself, meaning that it's not like you're not there. You're present, but you're not thinking about like you yourself doing things. You're not worried about the past or the future, or really how you are perceived, which I think is especially more inaccessible now than ever. I mean, people are always, at least again in my experience and in my personal experience, it's a constant reminder of like who you are, what you're doing, or what your future looks like, what your past is. We're constantly being reminded, and told the importance of like who you are and like thinking about you and being aware of your who you what your role is in the society and your family and whatever. Whereas I think this entering these flow states require all of that to not be like involved, and you need to be focused on the activity itself. The activity has to have rules and challenges that allow you to be fully immersed in whatever it is. And the difficult thing to pinpoint about this, like these flow activities, it doesn't really matter. You could be doing anything and still kind of achieve this flow. It really depends on the mental state of being. And it isn't really it isn't dependent on external circumstances. Now, you can obviously amend your external circumstances to make that much easier, but you certainly can't. It certainly is. It requires the internal focus to do that. But something else I was thinking just about, an idea that I was exposed to with regard to this was like somewhat about the importance of like rote memorization, which I've talked about before. Like the older days of school, they'd have people memorize like these giant passages or recite things, and even in languages, it was like memorizing terms of things. And I remember, very vividly myself memorizing all these chemistry terms and Latin infinitives and things like that. And again, at the time, and even now, even recently, I'm like, that what a pointless waste of time. Like obviously that led me no practical benefit. It's not like, I mean, I see Latin, I see some Latin roots of words now, but again, those weren't really the infinitives that I spent hours and hours trying to memorize. But I think part of what the importance of even those like somewhat trivial activities are, because at the end of it, like again, not to sound like a nihilist, but a lot of what we do ends up being trivial in the at all. It's like, imagine all the people that spent all that time plowing the fields by hand, when is now we have like a tractor that'll do the entire thing, like a lifetime's worth of work in like 20 minutes. So it's not to say that like their job was useless, but at that time it was still like is what they were supposed to be doing, and it was a good use of their time in that context. And who knows what will be seen as a waste of time, what we're doing now in a future context, when who knows what kind of technology or what abominations we're going to create. But the kind of the value and the importance of all this memorization was, again, to kind of aid and practice entering this like state of focus, because as silly and as stupid as which I agree as it is to memorize a bunch of Latin infinitives or chemistry terms, it still does require like sustained focus and attention, which I think was the point of it. So it wasn't necessarily about the content itself; it was about what it was making you do. So same with the old people that had to memorize poems or Bible verses or something. It's not about the content itself, and it's not like you need to remember that itself, but it was simply the fact that like kind of teaching us that attention and focus, or sustained attention is pivotal or very, very important to our well-being and our success. And that is kind of one of the main premises of the book, is that like being happy requires, and happy, again, I'm not going to go into the etymology. That word itself is very troubling to me. Makes me very unhappy to try to define happiness. We'll say just like life satisfaction or contentedness requires a lot of effort, and it requires this sustained focus and attention. And again, part of my philosophy on being happy is being good at things, like getting good at something. And good, again, good is entirely relative to who you are, where you started, and where you're going. And I think that is true too with like these flow states and getting into things. It is relative to where you are. It's not like getting good at tennis means that you have to be the number one tennis player of all time, or beat Rafael Nadal or whatever. But at the very least, it is an incremental improvement, and you being better. And you even see that with people that like comparatively to you make like pathetic progress. So like, say for example, it's some like, I don't know, some dude who's never lifted before, like is working towards a 315 squat, which again, I'm not gonna drop numbers here, but come on, that's easy. But like for that person, again, it is relative. That could be that is the equivalent of again memorizing the entire Bible by somebody, or being a chess grandmaster. And it's not to say that, not to trivialize people's pursuits, and in my kind of idealist utopia, people's pursuits end up, if everyone's trying to be the best at something, everyone's going to get better at everything, right? So even if you are like, again, the 315 squatter or something, that's still gonna, like, that's gonna push the 450 squatter up higher and the 600-pound squatter even higher, and the chest master to be even better. It's like it's only going to, like, you being better than you are, even as bad as that is, will still make everyone else better, right? And even just seeing people doing things, succeeding things, even as pathetic as they might seem to you as someone who's better, or even just like how this is not important. I don't care about chess. I don't care if your elo went up 500. But so people getting good at things is very inspiring and motivating, motivating thing. So I think it's good for more people to try to accomplish that. And my main gripe with a lot of modern societies is I just feel people have lost trying, and I realize that there is a certain uh, issue, like, effort is hampered by desperate circumstances. But at the end of it all, I still don't really, that excuse doesn't really work with me in the sense that I don't really have sympathy. We're like, well, things are hard and like people are desperate now. It's like, right, that means they should be trying harder, right? That means they should be like, when the going gets tough, the tough get going almost. And I hate to use stupid ass quotes like that, but there's a reason like the quotes are around, right? Quotes say a lot with a little, and a lot of times like that is where wisdom, essentially is distilled down into, is these little quotes. And of course, you can take them out of context. You're like, well, some communist said that, or that was actually a Stalin quote. It's like, it doesn't matter. Like, it shouldn't matter. Like, is what they said, true or wise? Or I don't care if they owned slaves or, whatever in their time, or they beheaded somebody once in, 508, like BD, AD or something like that. It's like, that's so far long ago. I don't care about the history of it. What is it that they said? Is this a piece, is this a chunk of wisdom that is useful to me? Yes, it is. Then, I don't care about the historical context of it, to a certain degree. I think, I'm not saying I ignore context or history, period. But when it comes to like the ethos of what that word is, whatever that quote came from, it's important now, regardless of who came up with it or whatever. So I don't know. Anyway, yeah, it's I forgot where I started with this, but this is where I'm ending. So yeah, it was intelligence and wisdom being very two separate things, and people are very interested in being intelligent, but I don't get the same sense that people are attracted to wisdom. I think it almost seems too privileged. It's almost a privilege instead of being like a useful, practical, intelligence person, you're instead like wise, right? And I think, especially when societies and culture and everything is going very well for people, I think intelligence does help you more than wisdom would. Maybe, again, when things are very stable and you're looking for employment or whatever it is. I don't know. I think, when things are going well, intelligence might, be more useful to you in your day to day, per se. Like, well, I have more money because, I use my smarts. But especially as things get more trepidatious, I would argue wisdom is always more valuable than intelligence, but that's just me talking. But I think especially as things become more difficult in, many different facets of life, wisdom shows its true power. So it's like, I don't know. It's like, intelligence is the bodybuilder kind of showing off their muscles, and wisdom would be the quiet world record holding power lifter, just wearing, very quiet in there, humble, not, hiding his power level, wearing sweats and a hoodie. That's kind of the wisdom equivalent to intelligence's, you know, trend cycle or something. Whereas I think intelligence eventually comes back to bite these people, and, their balls shrivel up or whatever, metaphorically, of course. Whereas wisdom, I guess if you're also on steroids as a powerlifter, it's probably, your balls are also going to shrivel up. Regardless, the metaphors fall apart. But my point is, I value wisdom over intelligence, and I think people underestimate the amount of intelligence you have to achieve a level of wisdom. Like, they assume that you have to be the smartest person, and only the smartest people have access to this wisdom. But the truth is, most of these people that are quote unquote very smart are morons and lack any kind of wisdom whatsoever. And it doesn't really require that much to be wise. I think what it does require is, I guess a certain amount of, hedonic sacrifice, in the sense that you can't, be running around, jerking off whatever intuition, whatever little instinct pulls in any direction. And it also requires, again, a lot of attention and discipline to develop that wisdom and live by it. Knowing wisdom is one thing. Acting upon wisdom is what truly, is true wisdom. Knowing is one thing. I guess living and doing is another. So I don't know. I think people should while there's not as much of a direct benefit to quote unquote pursuing wisdom, I think it is a more worthwhile pursuit than trying to appear intelligent. Because again, I've argued before that the measurement and the labeling of intelligence is a moronic, at best, at worst, and at best is a flawed mechanism for value. Whereas I think wisdom people know is invaluable, and they don't even try to like measure one wisdom against another because they know it's silly, right? It's like again, how are you comparing the Bach's a musical piece for Bach to an artistic piece from somebody else? Um, the Mona Lisa or Da Vinci or something like that. Like these are not, or an engineering feat. Like you're comparing the creation of a rocket to, an opera. It's like, okay, well, I guess, I don't, are you going to like judge complexity, right? That's not really fair, right? What about taste or history or, so many things that go into a calculation about which is quote unquote better. I think people intuitively know that it's a moronic conversation to have, but yet like, intelligentsia or people that are intelligent would, be quick to try and compare things or find ways to compare where the true wise would know that this is a stupid thing to do, trying to compare things. Greatness is greatness, I suppose. Yeah, let me move on to something else here. I guess sticking on the rough topic of knowledge in general. I think when it comes to like, again, not to contradict what I said earlier about the importance of perhaps just like working one's memory and attention. I think that was my argument with rote learning and memorization, was that it is a good I'll say like mental muscular activity to develop a longer memory, and an ability to recall things, and some amount of processing power to quickly recall things. But more on the subject of learning, I think knowledge, I'll say more concrete knowledge, simply represents a thin layer on top of the abstraction. Like learning itself is a more experiential process and not a mimetic one, whereas the recitation of bits of knowledge is mimetic, in the sense that somebody can tell you when the Spanish War started, right? And it's like, well, you can just blurt it back out, and that's a mimetic process, but that isn't necessarily the learning process. I think learning, one, happens completely inside your mind. It doesn't really require, you don't have to have anything to learn anything. In theory, you could sit in your room alone with the lights off and learn essentially anything, right? Just by thinking and allowing yourself and allowing new ideas to come into your mind and wrestling with those ideas. And that is, to some degree, to a very lossy and terrible degree, what I do with this. Because again, besides the little scripts I have in the game I'm playing, there's no other stimulus involved in giving me these ideas. But learning is a process that entirely happens in one's mind. Now, it is probably more effective with a textbook or with a book, or even like an apparatus of some kind, if it's scientific learning you're after, or just any kind of or a teacher, more importantly, to help you read the book, or something like that, or to someone to ask questions to. These are all tools to help learning happen, but learning ultimately happens inside of your brain. Like you have to want to learn something, and you have to allow that process to happen. So there's a certain amount of humility that involved with learning anything. You can't learn something. It's not an external process. I think people miss that. Not only in the larger education sphere, they kind of think learning means that you've gotten some credential, or you stood in a class, or you completed something, or it's like, well, I have evidence of my learning. I made this. It's like, that still is not really evidence of, it's evidence of knowledge that you might have acquired, or just evidence that knowledge that you may have once had. But I think truly learning is an experiential process that happens inside of your head, that can be aided by other people and by resources, but ultimately is not something that is done to you. It is something you do to yourself, and you have to allow yourself to do to yourself. And also allow external resources to help you. So it's like, even understanding, the nuances of the Spanish-American War, you have to be willing to wrestle with and open your mind to those ideas, even if they are just like, quote unquote, like just numerical facts about when things happened or how many people died or something. You still have to kind of open your mind to accept those ideas. More importantly, I think besides learning stuff like that, learning about even just how like for like maybe how like the different systems of the body work. Sure, you can memorize facts about like the liver or about the heart or something, but there's more effective ways to do that, is dissecting a heart, or listening to your own heartbeat, or understanding. You could memorizing the information about it is not the same as truly understanding it or knowing it. Um, and that's especially evident when you're thrown into kind of a news, even an analogous situation, one that's very similar to the stuff that you quote unquote learned about, but wasn't actually what you like learned about. You then have to apply apply the knowledge from the heart to a different organ or something. I wish I had a better example than organs. These are all very concrete things to learn about. But even like color theory, for example, like learning about color theory and which colors complement one another. It's like, sure, you can memorize the exact opposites and things, and the hex codes of certain colors that mean things. But until you're placed into a environment where you have to actually draw upon color theory to apply to something, you can't really prove that you've learned anything. You've memorized things, and you maybe have this surface level knowledge, we can call it, above learning, but the learning process happens beneath knowledge and is lower. And what I would call that is learning, whereas just the knowledge is the ability to kind of regurgitate kind of widely accepted, truths or information about something. Um, Regardless, I just think, I don't know. I feel like to a certain extent, higher education and people kind of miss that idea about learning versus like knowledge, and applying it further down from intelligence and the increasing sophistication versus like developing of wisdom, which again we don't. I think kind of underlies everything that I don't know. Anyway, um, yeah. So I was thinking about the quote, like not even the quote, but like people talk about like it's good to see like the fruits of your labor. And I was thinking more about the book I'm reading, and I think instead of thinking like when am I going to see the fruits of my labor, I think a better way would be to think the fruits are my labor, right? Right. You working on something is the process that you enjoy. So you working towards a goal is kind of the goal in itself. So it's like, for example, like let's say I wanted to, I want to be better at bowling, and I'm sure I'm not going to be the best bowler on the planet, but I can at the very least like develop skills, and maybe I have like more tangible goal. I want to bowl a 250 or 200 or something, and that can be like the fruits of your labor could be you bowling the 200. But I would argue that more importantly, it's not the simple act of you bowling a certain number that like made it all worth it. I think it was the entire process. The fruits of that process was all those hours and time and effort spent doing it. Like the fruits are the labor itself, not necessarily something out, a prize that happens or an award that you win or something. I think the very act of doing something should be its own purpose. And I think that's where this like, quote unquote flow or this, happiness and kind of the right way to exist happens is when the fruits of what you're doing are the labor, and it is you would do this no matter what, and you would do this without getting paid. You do this anyway. It wouldn't matter. The fruits are your labor, which I thought was a more interesting way, or just a way to flip around, an often used quote, about looking for the fruits of your labor into something that was at least more meaningful to a life well lived. So I don't know. I thought of that today, and wanted to share. I was also thinking about, this is totally, I'm jumping around here, but who cares? I guess I'll actually talk about this too. When I talked about mimicry, mimicry being like a kind of one facet or one way to learn or one method of, I guess, showing intelligence is to kind of mimic. And mimicry can also just be like recitation of something. So again, I tell you when the Spanish-American War started, and you're mimicking it by just reciting it again. That's I'm kind of referring to that as mimicry. But if I'm going to rope technology into this, because I always do, we can think of mimicry as the ultimate goal of large language model systems. Whereas for humans and our well-being and our lives, mimicry only ever represents an intermediate goal in our goals. Our ultimate goals are, I would say learning or this knowledge or this, I guess whatever abstraction or whatever word pleases you the most beyond just like this mimicry. But I think the goal of these large language model systems is to mimic human intelligence and human behavior. Whereas, I think you'd be hard pressed to find somebody that that humans exist for the sole purpose of creating knowledge. It's like, no, I think you can make you can make the biological argument that we exist to kind of perpetuate our own existence. You could make even like the, I don't know, uh, space anthropological argument where it's like, it's our job to kind of populate other planets, or spread intelligent life or something like that. You can make many different arguments about that, but I don't think mimicking other humans is our terminal goal. Whereas I think the terminal goal of a machine learning based large language model system is to just mimic human speech, or in the case of uh, a photo thing, it's to mimic human photos or mimic human videos. It's simply that is kind of the terminal goal of that program. Whereas the terminal goal of humans as programs is kind of still yet to be determined. No one, we haven't really collectively or individually or at all really decided what the purpose of our existence is. I think anyone that is claiming to have the final answer to that, and fighting for their say to say, well, this is our purpose of existence, I think is in the wrong. I don't think it's. Not only do I think it's selfish and unfair to just claim that you have the answer to why humanity exists, and everyone should adopt your perspective, but I think it's also it's an insult to people who have other valid, because there's many different valid ways of justifying or of contextualizing the purpose of human existence. Not at all, almost none of which involve merging with technology to create some stupid fake communist bullshit society that it ends up going to implode or in nuclear holocaust. That's certainly not the goal of humanity. Is not to nuke ourselves into out of existence. I think almost everyone should agree with that, but that is kind of what seems to be the terminal goal of some of these technocrats or whatever. But not to dwell on that topic, but I just thought it was interesting to think of the terminal goals of these programs, because ultimately, like, beyond the LLM, like, oh, it does what I say. Well, yeah, it's mimicking a human to do what you say, but ultimately its ends are the ends that you provide it, right? And it's going to mimic what ultimately a human would say. It's just for cheaper than a human. But of course, it also isn't a human, so it doesn't share the same underlying human confusion about what it is that why we're here. And I think people also mistake the lack of a clear answer with like no answer, or like, well, great, I can make my own answer and it's this and everyone has to agree with me. I think that is also I think ultimately stepping on other people's life philosophies is the sinful philosophy. Like, and I've said before, like, as long as the reason that you have to live, or that your philosophical framework allows for the existence of what I might call like a parallel opposite. So it's like, I don't know, if your philosophy is, I only, I don't know, nobody starves to death or something, and that somehow allows for everyone starves to death as a another philosophy. Those can't really exist, because like, you can't really force people not to starve to death if they want to for any reason, or if they do for any circumstantial reason. And then B, like, the opposite philosophy also can't coexist with your thing. Whereas like a philosophy where it's like each individual should develop to their best of their abilities their own personal idea of greatness and perfection. That is kind of an okay philosophy, because it doesn't really impede anyone else's idea. It's like it's a completely individualistic, like, accepting philosophy that includes the opposite, which would be everyone is obligated to be a piece of shit and hate themselves and destroy their body. Which, again, I would say I would rather have the first one, but ultimately they don't overlap, in the sense that both of those people could coexist without having to require the other people to be pieces of shit. Like, their philosophy only affects themselves, which I think is the philosophies that are okay. I think any philosophy that imparts itself onto others and requires of others things that requires it really anything of others, I think is problematic. Now, I think there is, beyond that, I'm not saying that people would exist in a 50-50 between, self-perfection and self-destruction. But ultimately, like, I think the human will has a more desire towards self-perfection. I think if everyone shared that, like, the idea is to develop oneself into the best version of themselves, that is kind of an okay philosophy. Now, the other side of that is that, how actionable is that, right? It's like, okay, that sounds great, but then, like, how do I do that? And, like, fine, like, that's all good, but, like, what about the economy? Or what about a job? What about putting food on the table? Like, these are all, again, those are more practical concerns. Which again is not. I'm not saying I'm not ignoring that field as a important and valid thing to consider. But at the end of it all, I'm speaking more about vague philosophies and not practical political ways of managing society. It's just not really the things that I'm interested in. Which I realize it also limits my kind of ability to talk about certain things. Like if I'm not going to propose society-wide solutions to things, and maybe the underlying thing is my philosophy is more of a you know uh, an individualistic one where people need to take accountability and accept their own lives and their own destinies and shouldn't really rely that much on other people. So it was almost kind of this like anti-self or anti you know, relying on others philosophy that might be one that I think agrees. And I think there are people that really have to rely on others, and there's a certain amount of social, you know, being social that is required of humans really to be even remotely healthy and or well-being. And I'm not saying I'm not ignoring any of that, but I think ultimately, like especially when it comes to problems and your most of your day to day should be managed by oneself because that also it places the least burden on other people and least burden on the system if you're more self-reliant. And I would even argue makes you more capable of helping other people. I think people that are very self-reliant are super helpful for other people. Like, even people that can fix, cars or fix trucks or fix, can just kind of, are plumbers and things, that have these skills that are kind of known to be these more, I'll say more self-reliant, kind of off the grid type people. But it's not those people are like selfish, never. Those people help everybody all the time. Like those people are super. Those are the guys pulling over when someone gets a flat tire and helping them change, and they're people that are kind of, spat on, thinking that they hate everybody, that they're antisocial. When a lot of times they are extremely helpful with their skills, despite how self-reliant they are. And I think especially with the advances in technology and advances in technology, I think would allow for a lot more people to be, that much more like hyper self-reliant, and then that could ultimately result in a lot of people, having the ability to help other people with their self-reliance. Because once you're, and I don't think taking care of yourself, maybe let's suppose taking care of yourself and like covering all your needs to be quote unquote self-reliant requires, we'll even say like 20 hours out of the 24. Of course, the sleeping, eating, all that other stuff. I guess growing, managing your own food, all that other stuff is managed by yourself. But then you still have 4 hours left over, and I think most people and most humans are kind of hardwired to like want to help other people and kind of be like, all right, well, I've done enough for myself. Now I like what can I do for other people, right? And I think that like reciprocity, scaled to the size of society, would result in the closest thing we have to a utopia. But I think the direction that I see things going is more of a self-dependent thing where it's like, well, no, we can't trust anyone to do anything themselves. We have to manage how things are done. It's like, who's we? Who the fuck are you? Why are you telling me what I should do with my life? It's like none of us were, it wasn't like some people were like gifted by the gods or this. No, everyone just was kind of plopped here, right? And then everyone has to like kind of figure out what to do and, like make the most of their, whatever their time is here. But the idea that like somehow you have this divine decree to tell people what other people should be doing, or you have a better idea. I'm not saying you can't share ideas, but the way to do that isn't by force, or it isn't by like strong-armed coercion, right? If anything, it's by invitation, right? Like showing you people, here's what I do. This works really well for me. This is, you could do this too. This could be good for you. And it's like, okay, well, thanks. I might try that. Versus if you don't do this, we're going to arrest you and put you in it. And that kind of makes me sound like an anarchist. Which I think that word is thrown around a lot, and I don't feel like it's a fair, it's fair to say. But I think that in general, it isn't. It is kind of it's a philosophy you're born with. You're born as an anarchist. Every child is an anarchist. They run around grocery stores, grabbing vegetables, throwing them at people. I mean, they're not. No child is, is aware of authority and like, no, that is beaten into them, by their parents and the school system and the government, and then after a while they kind of grow to accept it. But at birth, we all are anarchists. And I'm not saying that we should keep that, but there's an element of that I think is wise. And same with all children. Like people even say that children have like these sometimes crazy ways of like developing like these very wise and moral things that most adults can't even come to realize it. But because there's a certain simplicity to it. And I'm not saying natural is always better, but to a certain extent, there's, what's gotten us this far in terms of millions of years of evolution, including the evolution of intelligence, there probably is a certain amount of wisdom that comes just with the children and how they think and operate with things. So extending that to to anarchy, there probably is a few elements of anarchy, at least the skepticality of authority, or at least the challenges with challenging authority being something that should be innate to us and should be embraced. I think are things that should continue and not be stomped out and beaten out of us permanently. So I don't know. I just, I've said before about the whole like overlapping life philosophy things. I think that is it's a valid way of contextualizing what are acceptable and or unacceptable life philosophies. As if the polar opposite of your philosophy can exist, happily with yours, which I think most of those only like, therefore, any of those philosophies have to be almost only like only affecting the self. Almost, you almost can't have a philosophy that involves other people doing anything, right? But the difference is you have to get other people to share that same philosophy, and if they do, then they can coexist. So for example, like let's say there's 10,000 people that all have this like extremely self-reliant philosophy that I described. But of course, they still have time. Presumably they have time left over, or the ones that don't, at least have enough resources to share with those in need, and they want to help people. It's not. I think, assuming that like because like you're independent, or because that you want to be independent, or you just want to be left alone, or you like being alone, that you like are somehow anti-human, or you hate other people, or you're super selfish, I think isn't true. Like I just, the amount of people that I know that are that just kind of prefer to be alone and keep to themselves, most of them are not very, very selfish people. I think a lot of the selfish people are the ones that are out and about socializing, trying to manipulate people into their social groups, and leverage them for opportunities and things. Those people are the ones that are selfish, right? The quiet ones that just kind of want to be left alone, and are kind of maybe the more like purist, old school, libertarians, or whatever. I'm not going to put a label to them, but you know who I'm talking about. The people, the homesteaders, and those people. Those, I feel like those people are often the most gracious and generous. Or they're not really given credit for being that, because they appear so selfish because they're so focused on their own well-being. But again, I think it's silly to be so focused on other people while letting your own sanity slip, right? It's like, how much of your own sanity are you willing to trade for someone else's across the world who's having a problem? It's like, all right, well, not that much, because if I'm so worried about them, then I might fall too. Then we're both fucked, right? Then we're both going to have problems, right? I need to kind of make sure I'm okay first, and as long as I'm okay, that my spare time will be spent, helping other people. Which again, I think is most humans, kind of gear towards that naturally. It's not like they need to be told that, But the issue is, if you don't have your own shit figured out, that should be the priority. It's like you should focus on yourself to the extent that, okay, I'm functioning at the high level. I'm doing, I'm kind of working towards what I want to be doing. I'm taking care of myself. Now I can help other people. It's the whole like, put your own mask on, first before helping others. And I think that, again, is super simple and is really dumb, but is still kind of a very highly effective, life philosophy and or strategy to employ. But I guess not super popular, I suppose. Or at least not popular in the sense that it's not very, people don't really apply that to, I'll say like policy, or to, I don't know, social things. You need to be more of, you want to put the illusion forth that you're somehow more worried about other people than you are of yourself, and that somehow makes you, well, he's so selfless. They care more about other people than themselves. I'm like, well, it's actually kind of stupid, because at some point they're going to need help, and they're not going to have no clue how to care for themselves. Therefore, they'll be like even more of a burden on other people when they were so focused on trying to help others. So I think, like, learn how to take care of yourself, like kind of limit the amount of needs that you have, and understand, what you need to be happy and, be well taken care of. Then go worry about other people. But if you like disregard yourself, and you let your physical body slip and your mental sanity slip, and all of a sudden you're fucking borderline schizophrenic who's 50 pounds overweight, it's like, all right, then now you need like a whole village to help you out of this hole you dug yourself. And you're now expecting everyone else to help you, where it's like, well, you spent no time helping yourself. That needs to be the priority. Like, can you help yourself? And some people, again, they're born with birth defects. I'm not talking about these crazy, absurd. By and large, most people should be capable of caring for themselves, to the degree that society allows, of course. Now, with money and there's a whole new layers of abstraction when you add things. But by and large, self-reliance cannot be seen as a viceful or selfish thing. It should be a good thing, that you aren't reliant on other people for things. I think striving to be as less, as less reliant on others and other ideas and other institutions and organizations as possible is a good thing. Just reducing dependence in general is good. I mean, ask anyone who uses or has run a software project. Like, the fewer dependencies you have, the less likely you have for things to break. And I think some people are advocating for like a hyper perfectly dependent system where it's like, dude, you're going to be in dependency hell and that's never going to work. Like, you need to remove as many dependencies as you can so the software doesn't break. And it's like, yeah, I know that you want to be integrative and you want to like use all these new features and have, but your software is going to suck if it requires all these different moving parts all at the same time. Like, good luck getting that to work. Like, even engineers know with integration hell, it's like, all right, you get each individual piece working the best you can, and then like, it's going to be hell when you put them all together because, again, dependencies and things break, as they're combined. Like, as complexity increases, so does the difficulty of keeping it all together. So I think the fewer dependencies you have, the better. And I think applying that outside of software into one's personal life, the fewer dependencies you have outside yourself, the better generally. And again, it isn't to say that you can't help other people or you're never going to have time to help other people. You will. Again, if you are, put thought into and are intelligent about caring for oneself, you'll have time left over to help other people. And you can be even more selfless than you thought you were before, but you weren't realizing how much of a burden you were on others because you failed to take care of yourself. So I don't know, that kind of sums up a lot of my, a lot of the wisdom that I believe to have acquired. But that is the kind of the thing. I think the truly wise don't really know what wisdom is, or at the very least, it's a slippery snake. It's not one that is, things might sound very wise, or they might be wise until they're not, and then all of a sudden, all that wisdom, is a figment of history. But there are timeless bits of wisdom that I don't think are going anywhere. Some of what I just said being that, but not all of it, of course. Yeah. I guess this is just one last take because we're towards the end here. I think watching something, while you eat is kind of the ultimate form of luxury, and was a decadence that I don't think humans were ever really meant to achieve at such a widespread level. And I think this kind of contributes to the absolute goonage that we've we've unleashed on the populace, like the amount of gooning going on, unabashedly gooning. I think watching something while you eat was reserved at one time for like princes and people who could like entertain court jesters while being fed grapes or something like that. That's kind of the image I get in my head. But now you can be like essentially a nobody and get DoorDash and watch something while you eat. And I just don't think that luxury was meant to be attained at the scale we have, because once you've kind of watched something while you eat, or you've gotten used to watching stuff while you eat, it is kind of like a, I think it's a, not only is it like, it's like just a sensory overload, right? It's like they listen to music while they're getting their feet rubbed, while they're watching a show, while they're getting their dick sucked. I mean, it never ends. And at some point it's like, then you're unable to feel the pleasure from each of those individual things. Like, eating itself should be a pleasurable activity, and you should take pleasure in the simple act of eating. Watching something, again, is probably a pleasure beyond our recognition or beyond our genetic understanding. Like, we didn't even conceptualize shows beyond live performances or dances that we've seen, but now we can do any of those and more on any kind of screen. But doing this at the same time, I think, makes each of them less potent, and then over time you're kind of needing stronger and stronger stimuli to then derive pleasure. Which I think one way to kind of, again, this kind of goes back to being able to control and focus your attention on things. Being able to derive pleasure from the least amount of stimulus possible is probably a good thing, right? Like, if I can get the pleasure of 10 grapes from one grape, why would I want 10 grapes? Like, in every way that it's better for me to derive more pleasure from less stimulus. So I think eating, watching something while you eat should be something you avoid, at all costs. You should either, the food should be the focus. You should focus on the food. And I'm not saying you can't eat with other people, because other people is technically like, watching something. But even then, is like, should kind of be like the peak of everything. Like, if you are talking to somebody while eating, like having a conversation while eating, that should be like, that's kind of the peak of pleasure. That's as potent as pleasure as you can get. Or at the very least, try to eat something that's not that good, so you still have the pleasure of conversation to kind of drive you through eating the salad or whatever that you're struggling to eat. But I think, like, eating Twinkies while watching YouTube, while talking to your friend, while getting your feet rubbed, it's going to be too much. and you're kind of just frying out your ability to derive pleasure from the simple things. Because I do think there's wisdom in that too. I mean, children, again, bring back to kids. I'm not Epstein, I promise. But kids derive pleasure from the most simple, stupid things. Again, I've always said that you could lock me in a room with an apple and I would be content, because I would, at the very least, I believe in myself and my ability to find a way to make that a pleasurable or enjoyable experience. Not saying it wouldn't be difficult to start. I'm sure the first couple hours, I'd probably be begging to get out. I would be, banging against the wall. I'd be upset. I'd probably, throw the apple or something and bruise it. But eventually I like to say I'd come around. I'd like to believe that I would come around and find a way. It's okay. Well, this is my new reality. It's just me and the apple. Okay, let's figure out there's some kind of game or something, some way to entertain myself with this apple, right? For the longest amount of time possible. I don't know. I'd start trying to, look for patterns in the apple, and I don't know. I'd find some way of entertaining myself simply, and I think, that is a good skill to try and develop, is the ability to be easily entertained with things. And not say you have low expectations for things, but just again, being entertained, not necessarily like thinking everything sucks. But I think you can think everything's great and be easily entertained. I don't think it has to lend itself to cynicism, but I think people kind of view that, and it's like, why are you torturing yourself by eating? Because so an example in my life, I eat my almonds with chopsticks, because you can only eat them so fast if you're eating them with chopsticks. I don't know anyone that can just shovel down almonds with chopsticks. And it isn't because I'm trying to torture myself, or that I need to go on a diet or something. I allow myself to eat as many almonds as I want, but ultimately, like, it allows me to, again, simplify the pleasure and derive as much pleasure from one almond at a time as I can, versus just shoveling them in my mouth, like a pig. I think it's better for me to have that moderation and learn to appreciate one almond at a time. So anyway, I'll leave it off there. Thanks for watching. Peace out.